Yeah, I guess I think of myself as a little bit of like a mall cop, right? In that like you're not meant to like have real authority, but you're meant to just be like, hey, like don't go piss in the water fountain kind of vibe. So I think that like the way I see that is a lot of projects will end up reaching out to me or members of the ecosystem team for advice or just thoughts on how they can do things. I think that our goal is just like sort of plant seeds and help provide guardrails more than anything else.
This episode is brought to you by Stand With Crypto. More than 50 million Americans own crypto. These are entrepreneurs, innovators, and job creators who are deeply invested in building a strong America that dominates this emerging tech sector. Stand With Crypto works to mobilize the crypto community around issues and elections. Find out more and see where candidates in your area stand at standwithcrypto.org. All right, today we're chatting with the co-founder of one of the most interesting, anticipated, and differentiated blockchains, at least in terms of community branding I've seen in quite some time. Berachain co-founder Smokey The Bera with us today on Coinage. Smokey, thanks for taking the time, man.
Hey guys, yeah, thanks for having me, Zach. This is like well produced. This is pretty cool. You guys got the
Yeah, man. I
animations
mean,
and everything.
this is the first time we've interviewed pseudonymous Bear on the show, and I'm wearing a suit. We're giving this a go,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I think it's quite fitting, actually, to be honest with you, because we can get into the specifics about what makes Berachain different from a technical lens in a bit. I'll tease ahead kind of the revolutionary idea of proof of liquidity, as it seems like that's kind of really what you guys have emphasized. And, I've been listening a lot to kind of what you've said on other podcasts and things. And I think we should start maybe with just kind of what makes Berachain unique outside of the technical lens, because, of course, as I said, this is the first time we've ever interviewed a cartoon bear on the show. But you guys are far from a joke. And I think it's very strange to be focusing in on like the culture here, but I think it's the most interesting part to me. So why don't we start there? Because you guys, congrats, by the way, on raising $100 million in a Series B back in April. But I heard you talking about kind of the advantage in terms of people kind of underestimating your team, thinking that, oh, these guys are going to be clowns, but very far from it. So why don't we start there in terms of how you've wanted to build Berachain's branding that kind of does make it a unique project in the space.
Yeah, for sure, man. I think that you've definitely done your homework, so that makes my life a little bit easier. Um, I think that at the moment, blockchains are at an interesting, stage in their maturity. In that, on one hand, we've seen a lot of people sort of pontificating from ivory towers in a sense of like, I've got the most interesting news, ZK, X or Y, add three or four buzzwords, tech over here, which I don't actually mean to, I don't mean to discredit that in terms of its potential applications. But I actually think that in many cases, it's very easy to lose sight of of the forest for the trees, or trees to the forest, whatever the right direction of that is. I think trees, yeah, forest for the trees. Fuck it.
Yeah.
Um, in that, effectively, you find yourself in a situation where you built something that's interesting, but what actually matters at the end of the day is, are you solving a problem for people? Are you building a product that users want to use? Are you building, in this case, effectively an infrastructure layer or a tech stack that people want to work with? And I think there's many different motivations that cause people to build in Web3 or to build on Chain A versus Chain B. I think on one hand, sometimes it is simply, can the tech support my use case, whether that's around, transactional finality, TPS, ZK proving, whatever it might be. Or it can simply be around, do I believe that there's a user base and a developer ecosystem here that I can fit into? Um,
Yeah.
and at the moment, I believe that the latter is perhaps a lot, more prevalent and a lot more real than the former. And I do believe that over time, as the space matures, we'll see, more of an era towards, how the best tech solutions can really fully differentiate themselves. And best is a very amorphous word, right? But perhaps the most enabling or the most accessible or the best UX can really differentiate itself.
Hmm.
At the moment, I think a lot of it comes down to the social factor of it. I think blockchains are actually closer to brands than they are to cloud computing companies, if you will. And I think that perhaps hilarious evidence of this is if you look at the Solana to Tron rotation over the last 48 to 72 hours, if you will. Like, all due respect to Tron, and it's actually one of the chains that is used by far the most in the real world around USDT, et cetera. But it is by no means, I think, what people would think about is like a commonly used like consumer blockchain for other use cases, right?
Yeah.
So it's increasingly funny to sort of like see how people are just sort of following a hot ball of money and attention, um, and that's not what I want Berachain to lean into. But rather, I think that it's important to carve out your own niche, your own culture, and something that stands out a little bit in the world of L1s that all follow a similar playbook, right? I think for a very
Yeah,
long time, we've seen like this metagame of it's like, okay, a new company goes and raises a few $1 million, spins out research often from an academic institution, or perhaps from a larger company, a la like Meta, and then Sui and Aptos, versus sort of like off-chain Arbitrum, IFAX, etc. And then you sort of like have this, I'd say rallying call to build a community or to build an ecosystem around it. Um,
sure.
I think our approach with Berachain was actually kind of the exact opposite, in that we started by building an ecosystem or building a community, mostly just for fun, around an NFT project of bears, which eventually evolved into a blockchain after we decided to, sort of pursue what some of the more, I'd say, exotic applications of that community could look like.
I think that's
So I
an
guess,
important. I think that's an important piece to kind of start with, and that's why it was the
yeah,
first thing I wanted to start with, because like you said, I think looking at the Tron and Solana rotation is an interesting one, particularly because I think they're leaning into the playbook that's now worked for Solana in terms of rolling out Sun Pump or whatever the meme
yeah,
token platform is. And so yeah, starting with community does matter in this merging of technology and understanding of kind of what people get excited by. Texas, I'm looking at the site right now. This is kind of somewhat meme worthy in terms of even the design of your guys' site and other Berachain projects. Some people might say, okay, yes, that's a small thing, but the little small things I think add up. The site only scrolls up. It says up only, and you only scroll up. These are little tiny
for sure.
things. But I think it gets at kind of what you're describing, which is anyone can kind of build technology in the space. And what is the differentiated factor of all of the L1s and all the L2s that exist, if not community? And I think maybe Solana proves that out. But for you, I guess, in terms of Berachain, again, we're going to get into the specifics of the technology. But how do you and the community that's there now kind of lean into steering that? And maybe this is a good segue into proof of liquidity in terms of rewarding builders in the community and not just, I think, replicating kind of everything else that exists in these launches where you have maybe, again, dexes, swaps, all the other kind of tooling that exists, meme coin launch pads. I mean, how do you envision that in the early days?
Yeah, I think that like it goes in a couple different directions, and for us, I think a lot about like barbells, right? I think that you want to be able to build things that can cater to the far left curve and the far right curve as well. I think that when it comes to our ecosystem early, like you know, uh, I guess one of the nice things about the way Berachain's been built over time is that we've been able to take, I'd say, a relatively organic approach to actually the app ecosystem build out. In that, we've had a lot of folks who are excited to build all those initial primitives, if you will, whether that be your launch pads or your basic piece of infrastructure. Most of which we've encouraged to have like a more interesting twist, right? I think there's very little, to be gained and very little like interesting about going to a new ecosystem and saying, okay, cool, I've got the same DEX, I've got the same lending market, I've got the same liquid staking derivative, I've got like the same, NFT, OpenSea fork, whatever it might be. I think people, crave cool new things, right? And I think that's perhaps more than anything else what we've tried to embody or enforce culturally. At the end of the day, it's a permissionless blockchain. People can build whatever they want, but I do tend to believe that the greater upside and the greater opportunities come in building things that are interesting and that haven't been seen before, and that draw on a use case that has not necessarily been fully explored. And of course, there's a lot of different ways to view that, and it's tough to say exactly what that looks like at scale. But I think that for us, it's very much a function of like how can we have people building things on Bearachain that are on one hand unique and culturally aligned with the ecosystem,
Mm-hmm.
but on the other hand, actually make use of proof of liquidity and draw value from the chain that they're building on top of. Right. I think for a long time we saw like a Mad Libs rotation of sort, where it's like you pop around from chain to chain. It's like I'm building the Aave for Near, I'm building like the balancer for Metis, whatever it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what we find a lot more interesting is like how can you build something that becomes a landmark in that chain and becomes something that is known for, defined by, in the same way that GMX was correlated to Arbitrum, Frentech was correlated to Base, that kind of stuff, right? And
Yeah.
we think about how can we curate an app ecosystem that has as many like emblematic projects as possible. And of course, there's only so much that can vie for mind space or attention, if you will. But I think you want as many shots on that as possible there, and we think a lot about that too as the ecosystem sort of comes together.
Well, perhaps pairing the points there too, in terms of, again, there are needs for skeletal tissue and bones in any sort of kind of crypto environment. And I think one of the value capture mechanisms, again, we're teasing ahead to digging into proof of liquidity, but before we get into that, I think maybe this is perhaps indicative of what you're describing is you can have those and some other projects that kind of are tentpole for community as well. I'm thinking of Puffpaw, looking at this kind of vape to earn on the Berachain as well, which is interesting here when you think about, again, I'm scrolling up only to look at these, and I wonder how much of that fits into this too, in terms of being a tentpole project that shows, look, we can be different, we can try different things. It's not all just the boring skeletal tissue of the other projects as well.
For sure. I think that groups like Puffbar are totally emblematic of what building on Berachain can look like. I think it's easy to over-index and be like, oh, vape's bad. But I think it's also easy to perhaps dive in a little bit further and then say, okay, cool, they've got a kind of cool incentive here that combines like a meaningful Web2 product with something that's actually meant to reduce a harmful behavior like smoking and transition to vaping. And actually incentivizes people to use less nicotine over time. So like stuff like that, I think is like pretty interesting. Do I think it's the be all and end all of Berachain? No, I think there's lots of other cool stuff that's being built as well, right? So, for
Yeah.
example, like when we think about like that broader, sector that I guess is being called consumer now, but is really, as I just think about it, like applications that a layperson might be able to use. It's like pretty funny. There's stuff like Over Under that's building like effectively computer vision powered sports betting on like esports streams effectively. So someone's playing Call of Duty or League of Legends or whatever it is, they effectively train computer vision algorithms on that data for extended periods of time and use that to automatically generate odds of different events and even different parlays happening in the game, which is something that we think is like just super cool when it comes to actually building something that can easily onboard lots of users, use the blockchain for instant settlement, and allow people to transact in a very, I'd say, rapid and easy manner. Right, so
Mm-hmm.
you can have people like watching their favorite streamer and basically betting on what those outcomes could look like. So I think stuff like that is really cool. I think there's groups that are building a bunch of fun stuff within DeFi, which is probably where a lot of our origin story comes from, and a lot of the time that I've spent in the past. So obviously an area that I'm super excited about. There's teams like Exponents that I think are super exciting and are effectively building the first platform that allows you to, I'd say, financialize like the tribalism of crypto to an extent, and actually allows you to directionally incentivize the longing or shorting of a given token beyond just like the funding rates. And
Yeah.
that you can have, a pair trade of X versus Y, and you can actually incentivize people to long X with other tokens or short Y with other tokens. Right. So imagine pitting, two communities against each other, whether that be Sol ETH or two different meme coins or, like long tail alt assets like, Compound and Aave or off the lending markets type stuff. Right. I think stuff like that
Mm-hmm.
is really cool when it comes to experimentation. And then there's much more sophisticated and I'd say like later stage institutionally driven products as well, like, Concrete Finance, which is built by a bunch of X.72 guys who are basically put credit default swaps on chain for the first time, which I think gets pretty interesting as well at scale. So I guess the overwhelming theme that I'm going for here, Zach, is just like, if there's an opportunity to build something cool, new, and interesting, we want Bearachain to be the home for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I heard you saying too before on another podcast that if you stop having fun, then you've lost it all. And I do feel like I don't know, this space is unique in terms of it doesn't need to, I guess, take itself too seriously. It doesn't need to present something that's not authentic because everything theoretically is transparent if you're doing it right on the blockchain or visible to everybody. So it's like, don't spit in my coffee and call it caramel or whatever the phrase might be. That's certainly not the right one. But
Yeah.
it's not exactly the case where you're dealing with a community. I think crypto users are very smart in sniffing that out. And so, I think it is kind of interesting to think about it that way. But for you, as kind of someone who's steering the ship, and I think as we saw, same thing when we had Anatoly out here, one of the first guests that ever came out to the Coinage studio here in Brooklyn. Kind of talked about it the same way. It's like, look, this is a decentralized kind of community. We, as the builders here, can steer a little bit of it, but we're not kind of controlling everything. As you said, this stuff is going to be permissionless when you guys are launched. And even right now, I suppose, a lot of the
Yep.
builders are doing so on their own. But how do you personally kind of look at that? Like, what do you put on your own shoulders? How do you ensure you still haven't lost that type of fun, especially when things are out there live, when things are broken? Like, how does that work for you?
Yeah, I guess I think of myself as a little bit of like a mall cop, right? And that like you're not meant to like have real authority, but you're meant to just be like, hey, like don't go piss in the water fountain kind of vibe. So I think that like the way I see that is a lot of projects will end up reaching out to me or members of the ecosystem team for advice or just thoughts on how they can do things. I think that our goal is just like sort of plant seeds and help provide guide rails or guardrails more than anything else. So definitely never mandating action A over action B, etc. But saying,
Mhm.
hey, I think this is something that can fit in really well with the community, or I think this is something that people might enjoy, or like maybe you want to be cognizant about like overly, making something formal to a fault, right? I think there's a time for serious products. I think there's a time for like more fun things. And I do think that a lot of like what I hope the Bear chain ecosystem can, demonstrate is sort of like that cognitive dissonance that can come up when something that's fun is also, quite effective, right, and quite competent under the hood in some manner, right? Because I think on one hand, that is something that causes it's just a deeper like mental or psychological impression, but on the other hand, it's just kind of more entertaining that way, honestly.
Yeah.
And I do think that fun maxing is its own strategy of sorts that people could benefit from.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And obviously, I think what you guys have done with the Bearabaddies is quite interesting as well. We'll save that one for the end of the interview. But I do want to shift into some of the seriousness at perhaps the risk of making people think that we don't talk about the serious stuff on this show. But I do want to give you the floor to kind of explain proof of liquidity in your own words, because as I understand it, I think it's a more efficient way to kind of use the capital in an ecosystem, and also somewhat of a deviation from just the standard proof of stake liquid staking tokens and things like that. And you guys are attacking it, just to explain it before you get into the details, with three different tokens, which I'm looking at here. You got BEX, BGT, and Honey. Honey being kind of your guys' ecosystem stablecoin that can be swapped, or minted via USDC. But how do you kind of back up and explain why there is a need for proof of liquidity and how Berachain's trying to tackle that?
Yeah, for sure. One thing I'll highlight really quickly is that basically we should probably change BGT to BGT Hub or Honey to the Honey Minter. Those are sort of like some of the highlight applications that are like built into the chain at the foundation level to start. Um, but the tokens are actually Bera, BGT, and Honey. So Bera ends up being the staking token of the network. BGT is effectively the governance slash like block reward token of the network. And Honey is the stablecoin, which is really just there to help defragment liquidity as it comes in from a number of other chains. We've seen issues in many cases in the past where you have like 10 different standards of USDC and then like 20 different versions of other stables. And Honey is meant to be, as vanilla as possible as a stablecoin, but really there to have, on one hand, an interesting product from a branding point of view that can be incorporated into a number of applications. But on the other hand, effectively something that can effectively help, not have 20 different fragmented sources of liquidity on the chain when it comes to stables. So that's one, just super offside. In terms of proof of liquidity itself, proof of liquidity is, I guess, best described as a variant of proof of stake or delegated proof of stake, in which really the goal is to turn liquidity into security on the network and to use that to power the applications that are building on top of it. How does that happen practically? It basically means that the block rewards flow downstream on Berachain. And that, typically in a proof of stake or a delegated proof of stake chain, you either have a validator, simply, putting its own stake up, 32 ETH, whatever it is, and then earning block rewards and taking that home, or you have a validator to which users may delegate, and then that validator takes a commission on all the on the block rewards that it wins and pays out the remainder to delegates. In the case of Berachain, you actually have validators directing the block rewards and incentives slash emissions that they earn from validating the network towards applications on the chain, and in turn towards the users of those applications. So it's really meant to be a flow through step of sorts in a sense, and that the validators themselves are really helping to support different apps on the network and therefore their users by proxy, as as basically different pools are incentivized, such that they can actually, I think, have a reason to exist on a given chain. Because I think one of the biggest things that we found to be quite nonsensical, as builders or just people evaluating different ecosystems was that there was very little like from a mechanistic or financial point of view that allowed an application to thrive on chain A versus chain B, besides the existence of other, of just, I'd say, a broad pool of capital in that chain or ecosystem. So our thought was, is there a way that we could actually bake this into the logic of the network itself and embed, liquidity into the chain itself? And that was sort of how this idea of proof of liquidity came to be. So the way this works functionally is that Berachain has a validator set of 256 validators. It is fully EVM identical, but uses Comet BFT consensus under the hood for single slot finality. So I would say that we are like 90% EVM, 10% Cosmos is probably the best way to think about it. Execution layer is entirely EVM, and consensus layer is Cosmos, but heavily stripped down, no staking module, etc. Which is why it's this weird Frankensteinian mix between the two. And what that really means is that one uses a Bera, which is the gas token and staking token of the network for economic security. However, and that is what actually determines validator's entrance into the validator set. Based
Mm-hmm.
on the amount of Bera that they have, similar to how ETH will exist in the future in terms of max EB, so you can have a min or max amount of Bera, allowing you to enter that validator set. However, the block rewards on the network are actually heavily BGT dominated, which is to say that a validator actually has two components. They have their Bera stake, which basically determines whether they're in the set or not, but then they have their BGT stake, their BGT delegated, and users can delegate a BGT to a validator to boost its block rewards. So you can think about this perhaps most simply in a y equals mx plus b type of format, where by staking Bera, you're earning a small percentage or a small portion of the total inflation or the total amount of block rewards produced by the network. But by actually having BGT delegated to you as a validator, you're earning your full potential, if you will, right? And the way that this actually works is that BGT is being emitted to different applications on the chain at launch. So each validator has its own gauge. The best way of thinking about this, if you're familiar with the DeFi ecosystems, is kind of like how Curve works, in that one can basically determine where they would want these Curve emissions to go on a global scale, and actually bears some resemblance to how Tau validator emissions go to different subnets as well.
Yeah.
So you effectively have each validator choosing, okay, do I want 50% of my block rewards to go towards this pool on the DEX, or this pool on the lending market, or this perps vault, et cetera, et cetera. And by LPing in those pools, users are able to earn BGT. They are not able to earn BGT in any other way. It cannot be purchased. It cannot be bought. It cannot be found on Uniswap or Binance, etc. You can only earn it by providing liquidity, hence proof of liquidity. And then
Yeah.
that BGT can be delegated to a validator that effectively fits that user's risk and/or incentive profile, right? So a user who has chosen to put a whole bunch of capital into into a stable pool on the DEX might say, okay, I'm going to delegate my BGT towards a validator that has chosen to delegate the majority or most of their block rewards towards that same stable pool, effectively hoping to auto compound their yield. What becomes really interesting here is that as the chain goes live, there's only a couple of applications that are effectively built into the base layer. There's a lending market, there's a DEX / decentralized exchange, and then there's a perpetual futures market that will be turned on over time, potentially via governance. And over time, really any application building on Berachain can become part of that set of applications that can actually be a source of BGT emissions and generation, right? So that you could be building everything from an NFT marketplace like SudoSwap to a credit default swap protocol like I mentioned before, or even a
Yeah.
staking vault on Puffpaw, and have that earning BGT rewards for its LPs or its stakers in exchange for some portion of that protocol's fees or network tokens going towards validators. So what
What
you
would
actually do
you?
is you. Oh, sorry, go ahead, man.
Sorry. I'll let you finish the thought there.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say you open up an opportunity for validators and protocols to interact with each other in a very symbiotic manner, as opposed to I think what we traditionally see, even in like the MEV landscape, where effectively validators are looking to extract as much value from protocol transactions as possible, right? In this case, you're actually sort of pairing them up and having a validator say, I'm going to direct X amount of BGT emissions towards you guys in exchange for Y amount of your token supply or your fees generated. And
Yeah.
that way, I will effectively have a call option, or I'll have some skin in the game in what you're building, and you'll have greater capital efficiency and the ability to actually decrease your user acquisition cost or your customer acquisition cost as a protocol. So we think of it as hopefully a much more healthy or symbiotic ecosystem that in itself really tends to allow for better outcomes across all parties, presuming that they're active. I think that what proof of liquidity actually favors the least is like your set and forget stakers / delegators, if you will.
Yeah.
Because if their pool goes out of favor, if their validator stops getting as many blocks, etc., then life turns to be less profitable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting, and I think, again, full disclosure, I think the Coinage X Dyke team and our community is excited by the project, particularly for that reason. In terms of, we validate for more than 40 chains, a lot of them Cosmos ecosystem chains. So it's interesting to see kind of the mix here. But I think that is kind of the unique piece of why I got into this game too, in terms of community and what we've proven with the community validator, the idea of the staking rewards going back to our community, in kind of how you're trying to pair all these things. And again, I read too quickly there on the site in terms of, Berachain, of course, Bera being the gas token.
All good.
But quite interesting in terms of, I guess, when you back up and just in a single sentence break down everything you just said, it's almost as if value capture is really the problem you're trying to solve with this technology. It sounds like, if you were
Totally.
explaining it to a
Totally.
non-technical person, is making sure that the value stays within, like you said, getting rid of passive people who are validating the chain, passive people who don't want to play a larger role in the ecosystem, if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah, no, I think like if you were to put it in a sentence, man, it's allowing those who've contributed the most value to the ecosystem to help direct, its incentives or its direction over the future, right? And I think that's probably the simplest way that we think about it.
Yeah.
And we've been spending more and more time trying to find the right and legally compliant descriptions of how we would best think about Bearachain for someone who's a little bit newer to crypto, right? But we really do want to think about it as a chain that drives the majority of its value towards the applications and the users and the groups that we think are perhaps most key in the growth of the ecosystem from an adoption point of view.
From the adoption point of view, too, though, I mean, I guess, there's been a lot of excitement in terms of when this is going to be fully out there and ready to go. You guys have obviously been iterating on testnet versions with an eye on this year to roll out mainnet, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of fully letting this exist and get off the ground. What are you looking for in terms of this year? What's kind of the message and signaling you're sending out to the community in terms of what still would make Smokey more comfy in kind of releasing the beast out there, Berachain fully in the wild?
I think right now, man, it's just making sure that we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's on everything from the code point of view, and just going back to back to back in audits. Same thing on the economic front, so we can ensure that proof liquidity is a system that definitely has, I think, a greater degree of like math slash logic than your average proof of stake blockchain. And I'm probably putting it like too simply, but we want to make sure that that's pretty bulletproof because in a new system, there's always things that we should evaluate, and it's best to absolutely stress test that before letting it rip. And I'm on one hand, I'm both thankful and every now and then scared about the amount of attention that's been on us from time to time. Just because on one hand it means that hey, there's lots of really cool stuff that could happen here, but it also means that we have an even greater onus on ourselves and our team to make sure that we deliver a solid product and something that where it's bulletproof, right? So just trying to make sure that we really do right by the community and do right by the people who believe in us. And I'm comfortable taking a little bit more time to do it a lot better.
That's fair. And I think, I don't think anyone's going to be mad at you for that. Last, to wrap up, I know I teased this ahead, and so just to kind of end on it, which is kind of a funny thing to end on, but I do think it brings us full circle in terms of building things for a community that trusts the team building this thing and also not being so serious that there is no community. I mentioned Bearabaddies. And kind of this culture of, I think, at a lot of conferences out there, seeing bear heads worn at events, things like that. I also saw you talking about this opportunity on another podcast, and a skeptical eye, a cynical eye, could maybe say what really is going on here in terms of any time a blockchain like features women in a certain way. But I think you
Yeah, yeah.
mentioned it. So I was on a podcast and you were saying, look, this is something that is like an untapped opportunity in terms
Oh
of
yeah.
actually building products that like women care about in general, or B, just kind of like actually fostering a female community in crypto. And so I don't know. I'm kind of curious. I know obviously it's just Bearabaddies,
Yeah.
but since you had mentioned it before, it's like, okay, there is probably a huge untapped market for all of these things, and you see the same thing in TradFi. It's just like a forgotten kind of piece of culture. I saw it at CNBC and Yahoo. I mean, how do you kind of look at that as an actual strategic advantage?
Yeah, for sure, man. I think of it like so. I guess I'll preface this, right. A lot of people think the Berachain's like behind the Bearabaddies, or like we created it. It actually like wasn't us. It was a community member from almost 3 years ago in our Discord. Like one of the first people when we were just like an NFT project, who was like, "Hey, like I want to build something for like the girls in crypto because nothing right now really feels quite right." So she teamed up with a couple folks like Winnie from Chipped, and other like sort of I'd say prominent female founders in the space. And you know her name's Keisha, and she does a whole bunch of work behind the scenes, and is sort of like the real like driving force behind the baddies. And you know what ended up happening there, as I see it, was that like they I think built a brand for women that wasn't corny. I think that like a lot of the stuff in crypto that's been built for women so far, and I only have my opinions here should not be taken with much weight as a random dude, right? But it does seem like there's a point at which it can feel a little bit overdone, and I think that can cause a certain group of girls to self-select out as well, right? But they built it as something that was fun, that was just meant to be, on one hand, a little bit of an educational experience for girls in crypto to learn about Berachain and get their feet wet, but also to do so in a manner that didn't feel intimidating or hostile. And it was actually kind of funny because I remember when we were first launching our testnet, I was on another podcast and the guy was telling me about how his mom and his sister had actually like messed around a little bit with the testnet after he showed him, and like it wasn't intimidating or scary to them. They're like, "Oh, there's like bears. This is like kind of fun and cute." And I think that when you combine all those points together and also consider like how much spending power women have in the average household across the world, their propensity for user generated content, the fact that guys love to do things that the girls do in hopes of attracting girls in some way, like I think that there's just such an untapped market in better activating like the gals in crypto, and I also think that they're a lot of fun. So like when we think about stuff like the baddies, I just think that it's stuff that I really hope does resonate with like the ethos of the brand. And that on one hand, people can look at it and like be like, bear mass, like girls. There's a jet ski, like oh, like it's horrible, right? I'm sure it's very easy to cast things in like the most cynical light, which I get, and like it's understandable. I'm sure I've been in that situation at times as well. But it's also possible to take the other side of this and be like, oh, cool, they're trying to do something that's like good for the girls in crypto, kind of massive ripple effects, and could end up educating people about something cool, and b having a good time, which always feels healthy to me. So I think that's been like sort of our view on it. It's just like a really I guess a really serendipitous like community project,
Yeah.
that I think is going to grow into a much larger brand, especially as they look at expanding in different regions, and as we have like dozens of people hitting us up and hitting them up asking for merch or stickers or swag or anything of the sorts so that they can rep it. So like even on a daily basis, I still wear like the bracelets that they made at the party in Brussels because I was like, hey, this is like pretty fun. So yeah, I think I'm a big supporter of the baddies, mostly because I think that they are doing something cool, unique, interesting. They're opening up a new segment in the market, and they're doing so in a manner that feels very genuine
Yeah.
and very like well-meaning, right? And I think that's what I'd want to be able to foster more than anything else on Bearachain. Like obviously there'll be mercenary actors and there'll be just shitty players in every ecosystem in some way,
Yeah.
but I'd like to do my best to keep things like as pure and non-scammy as possible.
Well, kind of a good microcosm to wrap up in terms of, I guess, the branding and also everything that we talked about before, in terms of authenticity and genuine building. Because, as you said, I think cartoon bears smoking weed as the brand sometimes might just have people, look past it. But the deeper you go, the more there is stuff here. And obviously, clearly, if you guys raised $100 million earlier this spring, there is a lot here. And I think I would also, candidly say I didn't know what the hell was going on. And the more we dug in, the more it was something. It's quite interesting. And obviously, our community, as a community-owned show, told us you got to have Smokey on. And here we are. The first time we've ever had a cartoon bear on the show. But I got to say, man, congrats. Thank you for coming on, and thank you for explaining it to us. But we'll be watching as we get closer to the full launch.
For sure. Cheers, man. Thanks so much for having me.